Okay, Chapter 14. This is the start of the new unit with conflict over slavery and the coming of the Civil War. So North and South at this point are battling over slavery's extension in the territories. You have the Whigs versus Democrats. Whigs and Northern Democrats support the Wilmot Proviso, the whole thing of keeping slavery out of the territories. Issue of slavery is going to become the focus of the 1840s after the Mexican-American War, with the Mexican Cession and the question of whether or not to add or to exclude slavery from those territories. Slavery had been pretty much out of politics at this point. Even all the way from the founding fathers, thought it was just kind of too much to handle at that time, thought it would really just die out on its own. They could not abolish an institution of slavery as it existed, only through voluntary action. So you do have a lot of the abolitionists, northern states, hate slavery, but majority don't like abolition, they see the slaveholders as power-hungry aristocrats, so really kind of targeting them more than the actual institution of slavery at first, and then we'll move towards actually attacking the institution of slavery as in itself. With the Mexican Cession of 1848, kind of was a can of worms, opening up the idea and the issue of slavery, ruined the dividing states with bringing in Texas, New Mexico, California. The North was wanting Oregon, but you do have a lot of new territories to the South, and the question is, what are we going to do with slavery now that we've added all of these territories? There's the compromise line. We'll go over that. So the Wilmot Proviso, was the proposal by David Wilmot, said to ban slavery in any territory, free soilers, this idea of stopping the extension of slavery. They didn't want to end slavery, but wanted to keep the western land as an opportunity for the whites, and a lot of anti-slavery northerners kind of rally with them. The proviso will pass in the House with the different sectional loyalties in the House, but the Senate was a mix and a more even representation, and so the Senate is where it's going to fail. The battle over it kind of foreshadows the conflict between the North and the South over slavery. The whole thing was to prevent the extension of slavery, not to get rid of it as a whole, but it is going to cause a lot of conflict. At the election of 1848, you have Lewis Cass takes over the nomination for the Democrats from Polk. Polk decides he does not want to run for a second term, and he actually dies 3 months after leaving office. But Cass takes the expansion things that Polk had advocated and takes them further. He says that we're going to buy Cuba, we're going to annex Mexico and all of Oregon. Had a unique position on slavery, and that was what was called squatter sovereignty or popular sovereignty, giving the ability for the settlers who settle in that territory to decide on whether or not, when that state wants a petition to become a state, or that territory wants a petition to become a state, whether or not it's going to be free or a slave state. It's up to them. So popular sovereignty was supported by a lot of anti-slavery forces, appealed to a lot without directly challenging slaveholders, because it opens up access to non-slaveholding families and kind of is a easier political route to take. Free Soil Party, thousands of Northerners were joining this movement to combat the slave conspiracy. They organized a political party, abandoned the Liberty Party's emphasis on the sinfulness of slavery, and instead went on the against expansion of slavery side. Martin Van Buren was their advocate, or their candidate. Wanted to define limits on slavery, endorsed Wilmot Proviso. The Whigs had Zachary Taylor, not a lot of political experience, but he does have a lot of military success, so that gets him a lot of the Northern support. Also because he promises not to veto any congressional legislation, so the North is supporting him, and the South supports him because he's a Louisiana slaveholder, so they feel quite connected to that. The results, Taylor wins and immediately proposes to admit California and New Mexico as free states, which gets the South pretty angry because they see this as the Wilmot Proviso in action and another form of Northern aggression. They meet in Nashville, of course, with John C. Calhoun, and start to come up with Southern demands towards Northern aggression, and kind of start to see the survival of the Union hinging on whether or not they meet their demands. All right, Henry Clay came up with a compromise, of course. Compromise of 1850, California would be a Mrs. Free State, no more slave trade in D.C. I thought it was symbolic, capital taking a stance, plus it wasn't very democratic for the capital to be selling people in auction blocks when you were touring. Number 3 was to have a strong fugitive slave law, more rigidly enforced. It was also the most controversial part of the whole compromise. Denied suspected fugitives of a jury trial the right to testify on their own behalf, any other constitutional rights. and also to enlarge New Mexico territory to be admitted on popular sovereignty. Texas would had actually tried to take part of New Mexico to extend their borders. They compensate Texas with $10 million to give the claim on New Mexico and move forward from there. The obstacle was Taylor's opposition. Because, well, Taylor thinks that he should just have his plan, just vote in the 2 states, be done with it. And the other part was that it's this one bill that they're trying to vote on, all 4 parts, and it's not going to pass very well. There's lots of debates. Henry Clay, you have John C. Calhoun in the Senate debating all of this and taking different positions on it. Even William Seward was one of the debaters. And really what's going to help pass this bill is that Taylor will actually die due to intestinal complications, probably bad food, and Millard Fillmore takes over. He was a strong supporter of it and uses his powers of persuasion to bring the Northern Whigs into line. Some concessions, they break it up into a series of separate measures to pass, and that helps, and it all will pass. So the political party at this point is kind of turned upside down. The Whigs are trying to hang on. They really don't have anything new to try to bring in more voters, more support. And they try to take an economic route, try to change their economic stance. And really there's nothing they can do because it's a time of prosperity, and the Democrats are going to take that prosperity and claim it and take responsibility for it. And so the Democrats will succeed in campaigning across sectional lines. They promised to defend the Compromise of 1850, and so when the election of 1852 comes up, you have the Whigs nominating Winfield Scott, old fuss and feathers, and you have a split on him because his daughters were raised Catholic. He was seen as too lenient towards nativism, which is something that's coming up in immigrants, and the idea of towards new and spreading Catholicism and spreading immigrant influence was really unpopular with a large group of people, especially up in the north because of the cities where they're settling. And so there's a lot of things playing against him, plus you have a very strong party for the Democrats. And Franklin Pierce isn't really that strong of a candidate. He really had no personality, but he wasn't Winfield Scott, so that's really going to be why he wins. So we have a couple of westward projects. You have the California Gold Rush bringing in lots of new settlers, which was one of the reasons why it inspired a transcontinental railroad looking to connect the major money-making sections of the country. And this is one of the reasons that led to the Gadsden Purchase, $10 million to build it to the south. Stephen Douglas wants it in the north, mainly through Chicago. Being an Illinois senator, that makes sense. They'll eventually end up compromising and going into the middle. You also have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The bill was proposed by Stephen Douglas to organize and hopefully open to white settlement the territory west of Missouri and Iowa, bring Southern opposition for future free states, so it included popular sovereignty. It was actually really popular with a lot of people in the South because it sees that they have a chance to bring slavery farther north. It repealed the Missouri Compromise line, the 3630 line, because now those 2 territories with popular sovereignty could potentially become slave states. The act will pass. Northerners were quite outraged at this, and there's a lot more political fallout that comes from this. The Whigs have an indecision, causes the party to kind of disintegrate. They're split along the sectional lines, north and south. And the Northern Democrats, you have starting to pull in with some of the Free Soilers, divides the Northern Democrats. You have the anti-Nebraska candidates in the north. Democrats become pretty much just a Southern party. All right, so the collapse of the Whig Party brings up a temporary new party, the Know Nothing Party, based on the hostility towards immigrants. Millions had come in the 40s and 50s from Ireland and Germany, mostly Catholic, mostly poor. And so with the increased Catholic immigration, you have more tension. The Know Nothings won't last very long. They don't have a lot of leadership. They really couldn't capitalize on their popularity, and they really didn't have a stance on slavery. So because that is such a big issue at the time, they're not going to last for very long. They did start as a secret order, so when you'd ask them what their party was about or what they believed, they say, I know nothing, keeping it very secretive, hence the Know Nothings. All right, so Kansas, the Republican Party started to emerge, unites the former Whigs, Know Nothings, Free Soilers, Democrats, and appeals to the northern sectional sympathies, appeals to nativists, appeals to those who oppose slavery in the territories, defends the West. So it's starting to build and appealing to a lot of different small groups of people. Bleeding Kansas as an event will help white settlers from the North and South begin to move into the territory almost immediately. Becomes kind of a small-scale civil war. Struggle along much of the abolitionists, the pro-slavery forces. John Brown murdered 5 pro-slave settlers, killed and pretty much chopped them up to warn people against coming to Kansas. It was known as the Pottawatomie Massacre. Violence was not just in Kansas, even though there was basically guerrilla warfare going on. Also in the Senate, Charles Sumner, Massachusetts senator, gave a speech against the crimes against Kansas. Pay attention to a lot of attention to Senator Butler from South Carolina. His nephew, Preston Brooks, from the House of Representatives, approached Sumner at his desk in the Senate and basically beat him with a cane. Considered a duel, but said he wasn't a gentleman. So instead, he just beat him so badly that Sumner couldn't return to work for 4 years. So Sumner was the hero, martyr of the North. Brooks was the hero of the South. Much more division, and sometimes in a quite violent way. All right, 1856 election. You have John C. Fremont. For the Republicans, they are gaining popularity, but not a whole lot at this point. Millard Fillmore for the Know-Nothings, and James Buchanan for the Democrats. And because he's defending the Compromise of 1850, he carries the election. And like I said, they are growing in popularity. Republicans make very clear gains in the North. The results of this was Buchanan had 174 votes, Fremont 114, so much closer than the last election. The House was divided. Basically, the Union is divided, not just politically, but culturally. You can't have the religion and the denominations dividing. Southern literature romanticizing plantation life. Northern literature condemning slavery, like Uncle Tom's Cabin. A lot of hostility towards those two groups from each other. All right, Dred Scott case is another incident that's going to help with the division and actually kind of hurts the abolitionist cause, because what they end up ruling on is that the Supreme Court can't decide on slavery in the territories. Dred Scott was a slave to an army surgeon who was inherited by his brother, so he sues for his freedom because they'd been living in a free territory up to the time the army surgeon died. But they say that Scott had no right to sue because he was a slave, not a citizen. Slaves are property, and Congress cannot make a law denying somebody their property in a territory. Therefore, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional by creating that 3630 line and prohibiting people from having slavery above that line. So they said they couldn't do that. That was unconstitutional. Didn't challenge the rights of an individual state to prohibit slavery. Just said the federal government was powerless to act on the issue. Kind of drastic. Makes a lot of people very concerned. All right, Lincoln-Douglas debates. They're both going for the Senate seat. Congressional election, 1858, very important because of the issues. Lincoln will go against the Southern plot to extend slavery, promises to work for slavery's extinction, goes at it against as a moral issue, a fundamental issue, more against the principle that slavery is denied basic human rights, defends white supremacy in response to Douglas, because Douglas starts to accuse him of promoting war, of interfering with slavery and advocating social equality of races. And that was the thing, is it wasn't so much getting rid of slavery, but social equality that people were not comfortable with. And so you have him denouncing Lincoln. Lincoln does lose this election, but it does free him up to run for president in 1860. Plus, it gains him a lot of public attention and popularity, national popularity from this incident. This is also when Lincoln gave his House divided cannot stand quote that's so well known. Stephen Douglas promotes popular sovereignty for the issue of slavery that was in his Freeport Doctrine. All right, so more pushing south towards secession. You have John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, trying to take the arsenal, start a slave insurrection, slave rebellion basically. He's found guilty for crimes against the state. He's ended up executed. The North sees him as a martyr, mourns the loss. And there's a lot of tensions, and the Southerners say, okay, in 1860, if a Republican wins, we're out, which is what's going to happen. Election of 1860, the Democrat Party is split, North and South. They each have a different candidate. Constitutional Union Party trying to just bypass the whole issue on slavery. Republicans nominate Lincoln, who didn't even make the ballot in Southern states. He's only voted on in the free states. He will win. And you have fundamental ideals that are different, North and South, and the South calls for secession. There's your candidates. I'm going to go through these real quick if you want to go back and click on these. And there's the start of secession. And that's it, chapter 14 in one video.